Hey guys, tonight we're going exploring the strange, slimy, surprisingly philosophical world of psychedelics. Not the I microdosed before my morning Zoom kind, not the I read a Michael Pollan book, and now I eat mushrooms with breakfast kind. I mean the full, buckle up, reality is optional, who am I and why is the ceiling breathing kind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a huge, genuinely heartfelt thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. You know who you are. The fact that you're out here shaping this channel means more than I can say. It really does help this thing grow. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is somehow always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I respect that deeply. Also, the channel is now on Spotify. Link is in the description if you want something to fall asleep to on your commute or, honestly, just while you're lying on your kitchen floor contemplating your choices. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, get a blanket. Maybe put your phone face down so the glow doesn't remind you that the real world still exists. Tonight, we're going somewhere your GPS cannot follow. Let's just pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to take a psychedelic? Like, specifically, what's the difference between a gentle, I see colours more vividly, and I love my houseplants kind of trip, and a full I have merged with the concept of time, and I am now a golden triangle kind of trip? Do some of them feel calm? Do some feel like being launched out of a cannon directly into the sun? Did ancient civilizations really do this for spiritual enlightenment? Or were they just trying to get through a Tuesday? Is there a dose where things are fine, and another dose where you're having a serious conversation with a geometric shape that seems to know things about you? And honestly, how weird do they actually get? Congratulations. You've just woken up sometime in the 1960s in a dimly lit room with a lava lamp and a lot of questions. The carpet looks like it's breathing, your hand looks deeply philosophical, and someone across the room is crying because a song is too beautiful. Good luck. Let's begin. Let's start at the beginning, which, appropriately for a psychedelics video, feels both very close and impossibly far away. A psychedelic, at its most basic, is a substance that alters perception, thought, and your general relationship with the concept of what is real. The word itself comes from the Greek words for mind, and to reveal so technically, psychedelics are just very aggressive mind revealers, which sounds much less terrifying when you say it in ancient Greek. What's genuinely strange, and worth knowing before we go any further, is that the human brain already has specific receptors that psychedelics plug into, like a key in a lock. These are serotonin receptors, specifically something called the 5-HT2A receptor, which has been sitting in your brain your whole life, calmly waiting, completely unbothered. Nobody asked your brain if it wanted this. It just showed up with a receptor and a very open mind. The serotonin system is responsible for mood, cognition, and perception. It's the system that your antidepressants nudge. Psychedelics don't nudge it. They essentially shout into it at considerable volume. When psilocybin, LSD or DMT binds to that 5-HT2A receptor, it sets off a cascade of neurological events that temporarily reorganizes how your brain processes information. The usual filters come down. The signal-to-noise ratio, which your brain spends enormous energy maintaining, gets scrambled in ways that are either fascinating, terrifying, or both simultaneously, depending on the evening. Here's what makes this philosophically uncomfortable in the best possible way. The brain's normal job is to construct a stable, coherent version of reality for you to navigate. It takes an incomprehensible flood of sensory data and compresses it into the relatively manageable world you experience as your day. Psychedelics interrupt that compression. They let things through that the brain usually edits out, connections between concepts, sensory information that normally gets filtered, emotional material that lives in the basement with the door firmly closed. The result is an experience that feels to many people less like hallucination and more like unfiltering. Like the normal version of reality was the limited one, and this is something closer to the raw feed. Now, it's worth being specific about what a psychedelic is and isn't. Not everything that alters your mind qualifies. Alcohol alters your mind, caffeine alters your mind, watching 6 hours of true crime alters your mind, arguably. The classic psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, DMT, are specifically defined by their action on that serotonin receptor and by the nature of the experience they produce, which is qualitatively different from other altered states. They are not sedatives, not stimulants, not in the same category as anything else the brain has encountered. Dissociatives like ketamine work differently on the NMDA receptor and produce a different kind of altered state, but they get lumped into the broader conversation because the experiences overlap in meaningful ways. What all of them share is this: they temporarily change what your brain considers to be the boundary between self and everything else. For most of human history, most people's brains have stayed firmly inside their usual operating parameters. The self is here. The world is out there. The ceiling is the ceiling. These substances dissolve those assumptions temporarily and with varying degrees of thoroughness, and leave the person on the other side with a question their brain wasn't generating before. Whether that question is, wow, everything is connected, or what is the ceiling actually made of, philosophically depends largely on the dose. And the dose, as we are about to discover, is everything. Psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, shrooms, whatever you'd like to call them, are arguably the most widespread psychedelic in human history, and they've been here considerably longer than we have. They grow on every inhabited continent. They pop up in cow pastures. They appear quietly in forests, minding their business, looking completely unremarkable. From the outside, a psilocybin mushroom looks exactly like something you'd pass on a hiking trail and ignore entirely, which is either deeply poetic or mildly unsettling, depending on your mood. The first thing to understand about a psilocybin trip is that it scales. A low dose, say 1 to 2 grams of dried mushroom, tends to produce mild euphoria, soften colours, and a warm, giggly sense that the world is actually pretty okay. Things are pleasant. You might hug your dog and feel like you've understood something. You have not yet understood anything. But that's fine. That's the shallow end of the pool. The mushroom itself doesn't contain psilocybin in the form that the brain uses. It contains psilocybin, which the body converts into psilocin, the compound that actually crosses the blood-brain barrier and does the work. This conversion takes about 20 to 40 minutes, which is why the onset of a mushroom experience tends to feel gradual. First, nothing. Then, a slight unease in the stomach, which is common. Then, around 30 to 45 minutes in, a gentle shift. Something subtle and real, like the world has been turned up by about 15%. By 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the dose and what you've eaten, you're well into it. At 1 to 2 grams, this is a pleasant altered state. Colours are more vivid. Music sounds richer. There's a warmth to things, a sense that the people around you are genuinely good and interesting, and that you've been not paying close enough attention. Some mild visual shimmer, especially with eyes closed. Emotional sensitivity is elevated. You might find yourself unexpectedly moved by something small, a song you've heard 100 times, the particular quality of light through a window, the fact that your cat is incredibly soft. This is the dose where people understand why others speak well of this. It is gentle. It is kind. It lasts about 4 hours and leaves you feeling, if anything, rested. 2 to 3.5 grams is the middle ground. This is where the visual component becomes more pronounced, where the introspective quality deepens, where time starts doing things it doesn't usually do. An hour feels like it could be 20 minutes or 3 hours. Your thoughts develop a connective, looping quality. One idea leads to another, which leads to another, which comes back around to the first one from a different direction. And somewhere in that loop, you've apparently been staring at the pattern in the carpet for quite a long time. This dose is where most people who use psilocybin recreationally or therapeutically tend to operate. It's significant. It requires a degree of respect and preparation, but it remains navigable. The mushroom is not neutral in what it seems to surface. It has a notable tendency to direct attention inward, toward unresolved emotional material, toward patterns of thought and behavior, toward questions about how you're living and whether it matches what you actually want. People go in expecting to look at colours and come out having thought about their relationship with their father in more depth than they intended. This is not accidental. It is, by many accounts, the point. It's also the primary reason psilocybin has attracted serious attention from psychiatrists and therapists, not because the experience is simply pleasant, but because it seems to have a particular facility for making people look at things they've successfully been not looking at. There is a line, not a sharp one, more of a gradual fog that rolls in, between a pleasant psychedelic experience and an experience that you will be processing in therapy for the next several years. With psilocybin mushrooms, most researchers and experienced users point to something around 3.5 to 5 grams as the threshold where things get genuinely strange. Not dangerous, not necessarily frightening, but strange in the way that the word strange doesn't quite cover anymore. At this range, the visual component isn't just colours look nice, it's patterns forming on flat surfaces, it's geometry where no geometry should exist. It's looking at your own hand and watching it briefly become a concept rather than a body part. Your interior monologue, the one that's been running like background noise since approximately age 5, either goes extremely loud or goes completely silent. Neither option is comfortable in the way you were hoping for. This is the dose that researchers at Johns Hopkins called a full mystical experience dose. That phrase sounds formal and perhaps a little underwhelming, but what it describes is an experience that the people who've had it consistently rate as among the most significant events of their entire lives. More significant, in survey after survey, than graduations, weddings, career achievements, and most other things that polite society considers important. That's either a remarkable finding or a concerning one, depending on your prior commitments. At this level, ego dissolution begins in earnest. The usual narrator, the voice in your head that is constantly processing, judging, planning, comparing, and reminding you who you are and what you think about things, begins to lose coherence. Thoughts don't complete themselves in the usual way. The sense of being a separate person, located in a specific body, in a specific room, on a specific day, loosens. This can feel like freedom. It can also feel like falling. Often it feels like both, simultaneously, and your usual tools for deciding which one it is are currently unavailable. Visually, closed eyes at this dose produce what people describe as impossible architecture, geometric structures of extraordinary complexity, self-transforming in real time, impossible to follow, impossible to look away from. Open eyes show you a room where surfaces breathe, where patterns emerge from randomness, where the ordinary visual world has acquired a depth and animation it doesn't usually possess. This is not unpleasant necessarily. It is overwhelming necessarily. The experience at this dose lasts 5 to 6 hours. The peak, the most intense portion, is typically 1 to 2 hours. During those hours, the concepts you normally use to anchor yourself to normalcy, your name, your job, your history, your plans, your opinions, become thin and distant, like paper versions of things that are usually much heavier. Some people cry. Many people laugh, sometimes at the same time as crying. Many people feel, during a portion of the experience, something they describe as love, at a scale that has no ordinary referent. The morning after a high-dose psilocybin experience, people frequently describe a quality the research literature calls afterglow, a sense of unusual clarity, emotional openness, and what can only be described as a cleaned feeling, like something has been wiped down. Whether that state persists, deepens into lasting change, or gradually returns to the baseline depends significantly on what the person does with it afterward. The dose opens the door. What you do with the open door is the other story entirely. If psilocybin mushrooms are the original, LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, is the 20th century industrial remix. Synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, who was working at the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company, and who, famously, accidentally absorbed a small amount through his fingertips in 1943, and then had to bicycle home through Basel, while reality rearranged itself around him. LSD became one of the most studied and most mythologized substances of the modern era. It is also, in terms of active dose, almost incomprehensibly small. A typical dose is measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram. You could fit thousands of active doses on a single aspirin tablet. The amount of LSD required to profoundly alter your perception of the universe is so small it cannot be seen with the naked eye, which your brain will find either comforting or deeply alarming once it's in effect. Hoffman's accidental discovery was, by his own account, immediately alarming and then immediately extraordinary. His bicycle ride home through the Swiss countryside, what is now celebrated every April 19th as Bicycle Day, by people who are almost certainly wearing interesting t-shirts, was the first ever LSD experience, and it established the template. Strange body sensations, visual distortions, a flood of shifting imagery, a sense of being unmoored from ordinary reality while somehow still being entirely functional enough to pedal a bicycle. He survived. He went on to call LSD his problem child in the title of a memoir, which is the most Swiss pharmacist way of describing having created one of the most consequential substances in human history. LSD works on the same serotonin receptors as psilocybin, but it is not psilocybin. The experiences are related in the way that cousins are related, overlapping, clearly from the same family but distinctly different in character. Where psilocybin tends to feel organic, earthy, emotionally warm, and inclined toward introspection, LSD tends to feel more electric, more energized, more cerebral, and considerably faster moving. Thoughts on LSD move quickly, proliferately, making connections in all directions at once. This is either exhilarating or exhausting, frequently both, and it is happening for 12 hours. 12 hours. This is the detail that separates LSD from everything else in the classic psychedelic category. Psilocybin mushrooms are 6 to 8 hours, DMT is 15 minutes, LSD is 12 hours, and it does not have an easy off button. You are in it for the duration. This is worth knowing before you take it, particularly if you have somewhere to be the next morning, or the next morning, or really any firm commitments within the next 24 hours while the experience and its aftermath settle. The visual component of LSD is vivid, geometric, and highly responsive to external stimulation. Music is amplified in ways that are genuinely difficult to prepare for, not merely louder or more pleasant, but structurally different, as though you can hear inside it, follow individual instruments to their source, feel the architecture of a song in your body rather than simply hear it. Patterns on surfaces, wood grain, carpet, fabric, appear to breathe, shift, and elaborate themselves into complex organic geometries. Lights trail, edges vibrate. None of this is threatening at a moderate dose. It is mostly extremely interesting. What LSD specifically tends to do, at moderate to high doses, is excavate. It surfaces material, memories, emotional associations, patterns of behavior, with a thoroughness and a lack of warning that can feel like being interrogated by someone who has done their research. People report having conversations with aspects of themselves, confronting beliefs they didn't know they held, understanding with sudden and somewhat inconvenient clarity why they keep doing the thing they keep doing. This is the part where it starts having strong opinions about your childhood, and the opinions are rarely comfortable, and they are rarely wrong. An LSD trip follows a fairly predictable arc. In the same way that a thunderstorm follows a predictable arc, you know the general shape, but you can't quite prepare for the feeling of it. The onset is gradual. 30 to 60 minutes. After taking it, there's a subtle shift, a brightness, a loosening of the edges of things, a sense that something is happening, but you can't quite point to what. Then, over the next hour, it builds. Colours deepen. Music develops layers that weren't there before. Surfaces begin to move slightly, shimmer slightly, breathe slightly. Your thoughts begin to feel interconnected in ways they don't usually, and you may notice that you've been staring at a specific patch of wall for what feels like 45 minutes but has actually been 2. By hour 4 or 5, you're at the peak, which is where the concept of the peak becomes hard to describe because the word peak implies a fixed point, and on LSD, the peak feels more like a vast plateau with no discernible edges. Hours 1 through 2 are frequently described as the most uncomfortable portion of the experience, not because anything frightening is happening, but because you are in transition. You're no longer in ordinary reality, but you are also not yet fully in wherever you are going. This in-between state produces a low-level anxiety that most experienced users describe as completely predictable and not particularly meaningful, the mental equivalent of turbulence, not a crash. The practical advice from virtually every guide, traditional practitioner, and clinical therapist is the same. Lie down, close your eyes, stop trying to control it, let it happen. By hour 3, most people have surrendered to the experience in the way that you eventually surrender to a long flight, not happily, necessarily, but practically. You're not landing early. You are here. The plateau of the peak is, for many people, where the most valuable material lives. Thoughts arrive with unusual clarity. Emotions that normally live at a manageable distance become present and available. The things you've been meaning to think about but keep postponing find their way to the surface and sit there, patient and unhurried, waiting for you to look at them properly. By hour 6 or 7, there is typically what's called the coming down period, a gradual reduction in intensity, a gentle return of the usual self. This phase is described by many as deeply pleasant, a kind of soft landing where everything is still slightly beautiful and enhanced, but the weight of the peak has lifted. You can eat again, you can hold a conversation, you can remember what your name is, which felt less available 2 hours ago. Hours 8 through 12 are the tail. Visual effects mostly subside. The primary experience is fatigue, a tendency toward reflection, and something that resembles the aftermath of a very long emotional day. The kind that was mostly good but requires considerable sleep to process. Sleep, by the way, does not come easily during an LSD experience. The stimulant component is real. Most people do not sleep during the 12 hours, and the sleep that follows tends to be deep and long. What remains the morning after is typically what experienced users call the afterglow. A clarity, a warmth, a sense of having been somewhere important. The problems you've solved and unsolved 6 times are still there, but sometimes you found a new angle on them that wasn't available before you left. One of the most consistently agreed upon facts about psychedelics across researchers, therapists, traditional practitioners, and honestly anyone who's ever taken them, is that context matters enormously. The concept of set and setting, coined by psychedelic researcher Timothy Leary in the 1960s, remains one of the most practically useful ideas in all of psychedelic literature. Set refers to your mindset going in, your mood, your expectations, your anxieties, the unresolved argument you had with your sister 3 weeks ago that you haven't fully processed yet. Setting refers to your physical and social environment, where you are, who you're with, how safe the space feels, whether there's a window and whether that window is showing you something pleasant or deeply threatening. On a psychedelic, both of these things become amplified. A calm, comfortable, safe environment at a low dose is like a warm bath. An anxious mental state in an unfamiliar setting at a high dose is a completely different category of experience, one that tends to produce what people call a bad trip, which is a deceptively simple name for something that can feel very large while it's happening. The reason set and setting matter so much has to do with what psychedelics actually do to the threat detection system. Normally, your amygdala, the brain's alarm center, runs a constant, largely unconscious threat assessment of everything around you. On psychedelics, this system becomes more reactive. Stimuli that would normally be filtered out as irrelevant get through. This means that a gentle environment with familiar people, familiar music, comfortable surroundings functions as active support. The brain's alarm is receiving consistently non-threatening information and stays relatively quiet. An unfamiliar, crowded, loud, or socially complicated environment does the opposite. The alarm gets information it cannot quickly process, and at the doses where your usual cognitive tools are unavailable, that can escalate quickly. Think of it this way. Your ordinary coping mechanisms, rationalization, distraction, social performance, the ability to check your phone and reset your nervous system with a scroll are substantially offline during a psychedelic experience. What's left is more or less your raw nervous system, responding to the environment with considerably less buffering than usual. If the environment is kind, the raw nervous system is generally fine. If the environment is chaotic, the raw nervous system is doing its best, but its best is not great. This is why traditional ceremonial settings, the darkness, the music, the presence of a trusted guide, the structured ritual, are not arbitrary aesthetic choices. They are technology, refined over centuries, for managing the set and setting in ways that maximize the likelihood of a beneficial experience. This is also why clinical trials provide patients with eye shades, headphones playing carefully selected music, a comfortable recliner, and 2 trained therapists present throughout. Same principle, different vocabulary. The practical implication is that preparation matters, not just physically, eating well, sleeping, choosing a day with no obligations, but mentally. Going in with a specific intention, something you want to understand or explore, gives the experience a direction rather than leaving it to wander. Many people describe setting an intention as the single most reliable thing they did to shape their experience. Conversely, going in distracted, stressed, or mid-conflict with someone in the room is the most reliable way to have an experience that surfaces distress rather than insight. The substance doesn't choose, it amplifies, and it is somewhat indifferent to what you were hoping it would amplify. If LSD is a 12-hour journey and psilocybin mushrooms are a 6 to 8 hour expedition, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is a 15-minute launch through a wall. It is, by many accounts, the most intense psychedelic experience a human being can have, and it is also, mysteriously, produced naturally in the human body in trace amounts. Nobody is entirely sure why. DMT exists in dozens of plant species. It has been used ceremonially in South America for centuries in the form of ayahuasca, where it's brewed with a plant that allows it to be orally active. But smoked or vaporized DMT in its crystallized form produces something entirely different, an experience so abrupt and so thorough that most people who have had it struggle to describe it in any language that was designed for describing things that stay still. Users frequently report with remarkable consistency being transported to somewhere that feels real, more real, many say, than ordinary reality, and meeting entities. Not metaphorical entities, not dream logic vague presences, entities with apparent intelligence and apparent interest in whoever just arrived. The onset of smoked DMT is, by clinical standards, nearly instantaneous. Within 30 seconds of inhalation, ordinary reality begins to dissolve, not in the slow, gradual way of mushrooms or the building waves of LSD. Immediately, the room is replaced. The body becomes distant and largely irrelevant. What appears instead is something that defies consistent description, but that people persistently attempt anyway, because the pressure to communicate the experience is apparently very high. Hyperspace is one common word for where smoked DMT takes you. A realm of impossible geometry, architecture of extraordinary complexity and apparent intention, structures that seem to have been built rather than hallucinated, luminous and detailed to a degree that vastly exceeds the visual complexity of any other psychedelic experience, colours that don't exist in ordinary life, light that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere, a space that feels, to an implausible number of independent first-person reports, inhabited. The 15-minute duration is one of the most disorienting aspects of the DMT experience, because inside the experience, 15 minutes does not feel like 15 minutes. It feels like a very long time, or like time is not the relevant unit. People return from a 15-minute DMT experience with accounts that feel, to them, as though they lasted hours or days. This is consistent with what we know about how the brain processes time under certain conditions, but it remains genuinely strange, stranger somehow, than many of the other strange things about DMT. The return is abrupt. One moment you're somewhere entirely else. The next moment you're sitting where you were sitting, the room exactly as you left it, the world exactly unchanged, and you're trying to locate the words for what just happened. This combination, extreme brevity combined with extreme intensity combined with the apparent significance of the entities encountered, is what gives DMT its unusual status in psychedelic culture. Other psychedelics are described as journeys. DMT is described repeatedly as contact, whether it's contact with something external or an extremely vivid production of the human unconscious remains an open question. But sitting there afterward, genuinely uncertain which one it was, is a specific and deeply humbling experience. This is the part of the DMT section where things get genuinely puzzling, and the puzzle doesn't politely resolve itself by the end of the paragraph. Across cultures, across decades, across people with no contact with each other, DMT users report strikingly similar encounters with what researcher Rick Strassman, who conducted the first federally approved psychedelic research in the United States in the 1990s, called beings, entities variously described as jesters, machine elves, insectoid intelligences, or simply presences that radiate a sense of welcome, amusement, or overwhelming care. The consistency is what raises eyebrows. You'd expect hallucination to be personal, idiosyncratic, unique to each mind. And much of a DMT experience is. But the entity contact reports, across the globe, across decades, share specific qualities that a statistician would find uncomfortable to dismiss. No one knows what these beings are. They might be artifacts of how the serotonin system processes extreme stimulation. They might be something else entirely. 15 minutes after the experience ends, you're back on the couch, and the ceiling is just a ceiling again, and you're left with a question you cannot unask. Rick Strassman administered intravenous DMT to 60 volunteers at the University of New Mexico between 1990 and 1995. documenting their experiences in careful detail. What he found, and what he published in his 2000 book DMT, The Spirit Molecule, was that contact with non-human intelligences was not an occasional report, it was the majority report. Participants who received the higher doses frequently described being greeted, examined, communicated with, or shown things by beings they perceived as distinct entities with their own agendas. The beings were not always benevolent. They were not always malevolent. They were, most consistently, interested. What makes this genuinely strange, rather than simply interesting, is the independence of the reports. The machine elves described by Terence McKenna in the 1980s, small, self-transforming, gift-giving, impossibly cheerful beings encountered in a space of impossible geometry, were described before widespread internet access made such descriptions freely available for suggestion. The entities described by indigenous Amazonian healers using ayahuasca, beings associated with specific plants, animals, or cosmic forces, don't obviously resemble McKenna's machine elves, but they share the quality of apparent independence, of seeming to exist in a space the tripper has arrived in rather than a space the tripper has created. Surveys of DMT users consistently find that the majority of those who encounter entities rate the experience as one of the most meaningful of their lives. They rate the entities as more real than ordinary reality. They describe communication not through language necessarily, but through direct transmission of information or feeling, and they frequently describe receiving specific content, images, understandings, something resembling instruction that they couldn't account for by reference to their prior knowledge or imagination. None of this constitutes evidence for the independent existence of DMT entities as literal beings external to the mind. Neuroscience has reasonable candidate explanations involving the visual cortex, the default mode network, and the brain's tendency to generate agency and face-like patterns from complex visual information. But sitting across from someone who has just returned from 15 minutes in hyperspace, watching them try to find words for what they saw, you notice something that the candidate explanations don't fully account for. They are not describing something they invented. They are describing something they encountered. The distinction may be philosophical. It does not feel philosophical to them. Ayahuasca is not a recreational substance. This is the consensus of virtually everyone who has encountered it, including many people who came to it looking for something recreational. It is a brew prepared from two plants, the Banisteropsis capi vine and the leaves of the Psychotria viridis shrub, that indigenous groups throughout the Amazon basin have used in healing ceremonies for what archaeological evidence suggests may be thousands of years. The combination works because the vine contains compounds called MAOIs, which prevent the body from immediately breaking down the DMT in the leaves, making it orally active over a period of 4 to 6 hours rather than 15 minutes. What this means practically is that an ayahuasca experience is sustained, deep, and chi, the word that comes up in nearly every account, relentless. It does not pause while you gather yourself. It does not offer a moment where you can step out and get some air and come back refreshed. It proceeds at its own pace, with its own agenda, and that agenda has been described in approximately equal proportion as profoundly healing and profoundly terrifying, sometimes within the same hour. The setting of a traditional ayahuasca ceremony is important in ways that go beyond the practical. A skilled facilitator, in Amazonian tradition, a curandero or ayahuasquero, holds the ceremony through the use of Icaros, which are healing songs sung or whistled directly to and around the participants throughout the night. These songs are not ambient background music. They are the primary technology of the ceremony. Icaros are believed to guide, protect, and navigate the experience. Different songs for opening, for healing specific conditions, for calling specific plants or spirits, for closing. Experienced practitioners have extensive repertoires of Ikaros, developed over years of training. The relationship between the music and the experience of participants is, by consistent report, direct and immediate. When the singing shifts, the experience shifts. This is not metaphor. The brew itself is deeply unpleasant to drink. It is thick, dark, and bitter in a way that registers as wrong. At a fundamental sensory level, your body's initial reaction is often resistance, which is somewhat appropriate given what is about to happen. The onset is slower than smoked DMT, typically 30 to 60 minutes, and builds gradually into an experience that occupies a different register from other psychedelics. Where psilocybin tends toward introspection and LSD toward cognition, ayahuasca is frequently described as the one that feels most like being worked on, as though the medicine has a specific intention related to your specific situation and is proceeding methodically. The content of ayahuasca visions tends toward the natural and the serpentine, jaguars, anacondas, vines, and roots. Geometric patterns derived from plant forms, the Amazon itself as a living intelligence. Encounters with what practitioners call plant spirits, non-human intelligences associated with specific plants that convey healing information, are common in traditional contexts and reported regularly by Westerners encountering the brew for the first time. Many report visions that address the specific issue they brought with them, with a directness and specificity that they find difficult to attribute to coincidence. The emotional content can be overwhelming. Grief surfaces, fear surfaces, old wounds arrive with the unhurried inevitability of something that has been waiting for permission. The traditional framework holds that what surfaces is what needs to be healed, that the medicine does not show you things for entertainment, but because you need to see them. This framework does not make the process comfortable, but it makes it legible, and legibility, during an experience that might otherwise feel formless and threatening, is worth quite a lot. Let's address what ceremony facilitators call la purga, the purge, which is the medical community's way of saying that ayahuasca, with some regularity, will cause you to vomit. Sometimes at length, sometimes dramatically, often at the exact moment that you're also having a profoundly beautiful visionary experience, which is a combination that would be objectively absurd in any other context. In traditional Amazonian healing frameworks, the purge is not considered an unfortunate side effect. It is considered part of the medicine, the body physically releasing what the psyche is processing. Practitioners speak of it as cleansing, old grief, old fear, old patterns that have been lodged somewhere they shouldn't be, being expelled through the only route available. Whether or not you subscribe to that framework, the neurological reality is that the gut is densely packed with serotonin receptors, and hitting them with a sustained dose of DMT produces physical responses that are, it turns out, mostly about vomiting. Your mileage may vary, but if you attend an ayahuasca ceremony and don't throw up, someone in the room probably will, and the appropriate response in this specific cultural context is to hand them a bucket and spiritually applaud. The preparation for an ayahuasca ceremony typically includes a dietary protocol that traditional practitioners call the dieta. The dieta varies across traditions, but generally involves avoiding red meat, pork, alcohol, fermented foods, recreational drugs, and sexual activity for a period of days or weeks before the ceremony. The MAOI component of the brew makes some of these restrictions medically necessary rather than merely ritualistic. Certain foods and medications combined with MAOIs can cause dangerous elevations in blood pressure. Others are restricted for reasons that traditional practitioners describe in terms of spiritual preparation, clearing the body's energetic field, reducing interference, arriving at the ceremony as clean a vessel as possible. The purge, when it comes, tends to arrive at precisely the moment that seems least convenient, at the peak, when the visions are at their most intense, when the emotional material is most overwhelming. This timing is consistent enough across experiences that many practitioners consider it functionally related, the vomiting coinciding with the release of whatever the medicine has surfaced. The experience of purging during an ayahuasca ceremony is described, frequently and with genuine puzzlement by people who do not usually speak this way, as a relief. Not just physical relief, though that too, but relief of a deeper kind, the feeling of something leaving that had been lodging somewhere for a long time. The purge is not always or only vomiting. The purge in the broader traditional sense refers to any form of physical release that the medicine produces, crying, shaking, sweating, laughing involuntarily. These are all considered expressions of the same process, the body finding its way to release what the psyche is processing. In this framework, the ceremony is not something that happens to your mind while your body waits patiently. The body's entirely involved, which is consistent with what modern neuroscience understands about how emotional memory is stored and processed, not abstractly, but somatically, in the muscles, the gut, the nervous system. Ayahuasca, in this reading, is doing something that talk therapy often cannot. Accessing the material where it actually lives. What almost everyone who has attended an ayahuasca ceremony agrees on, regardless of their prior spiritual framework, is that the purge is not the worst part of the night. It is in fact frequently described as one of the better parts, the moment where something shifts from accumulating to releasing. The worst parts are the things the medicine shows you before it decides you're ready to let them go. But that's the whole ceremony, really. One long, uncomfortable, occasionally glorious, often nauseating process of being shown what you needed to see and then, eventually, being allowed to put it down. Mescaline is one of the oldest known psychedelics in human use. It is found naturally in several cacti, most famously peyote, a small spineless cactus native to the Chihuahuan Desert, and has been used ceremonially by indigenous peoples of Mexico and the American Southwest for at least 5,000 years, possibly longer. What distinguishes mescaline from many of its counterparts, besides its cactus-based origin story, is its timeline. Peyote in particular is notorious for how slowly it begins. You take it. An hour passes, nothing. An hour and a half, still nothing. Or something so subtle you keep second-guessing it. 2 hours, maybe a little nausea, maybe a slight warmth. 2.5 hours, and then, slowly, from somewhere underneath the day, things begin to shift. The mescaline experience is frequently described as the most natural feeling of the major psychedelics, the one that feels least like a chemical, and most like a slow, deep opening, a gentleness underneath its considerable power. Peyote buttons, the dried, disc-shaped crowns of the cactus, are bitter in a way that requires some dedication to consume. Many people find them deeply nauseating before the experience begins, which is a recurring theme in this entire genre of substance, and which the indigenous traditions that developed around these plants incorporated into their ceremonial frameworks, normalizing the body's initial resistance as part of the process, rather than a reason to reconsider. The traditional approach is to sit with the discomfort patiently, knowing that it passes, and that what comes after it is the point. The mescaline visual experience is distinct from both psilocybin and LSD in character, where LSD visuals tend toward the geometric and electric, and psilocybin visuals toward the organic and flowing. Mescaline visuals are frequently described as exceptionally colourful and as particularly connected to the natural world, vivid, jewel-toned, saturated with a quality of beauty that feels less generated by the brain and more like the world becoming more itself. Nature, trees, light, the texture of stone, the patterns of living things, appears to take on an intensity and aliveness that experienced users consistently describe as revelatory rather than distorted. Like this is what a tree actually is, and the ordinary version was the edited one. Aldous Huxley's 1954 book The Doors of Perception, possibly the most famous first-person psychedelic account in the Western literary tradition, describes a mescaline experience in which a vase of flowers becomes an encounter with the fundamental nature of existence. Huxley, a man of considerable intellectual equipment, found himself without adequate words. He reached for William Blake. He reached for Meister Eckhart. He ultimately settled on describing the experience as a direct apprehension of isness, the bare fact of existence, which is ordinarily so thoroughly processed and categorized by the mind that it's never actually encountered. The flowers were not more beautiful, they were more real. This distinction, which sounds philosophical to the point of absurdity, is described by mescaline users with striking regularity. The experience lasts 10 to 12 hours, longer than psilocybin, comparable to LSD, and considerably more physically comfortable than either in terms of body sensations. The slow onset and the gentle quality of the experience are balanced by its duration and by the depth of the introspective territory it can open. It is not, by any account, a mild experience at a full dose, but it has a quality that practitioners and researchers describe as fundamentally kind, as though the medicine is not interested in pushing you into difficult places, but in showing you beautiful ones, and trusting that what you find beautiful will tell you something important about what you value and whether you're living accordingly. A traditional Native American church peyote ceremony, a prayer meeting as it's called, lasts from sunset to sunrise. This is not a casual evening. You sit on the ground in a circle around a central fire on a dirt floor for approximately 12 hours. There is singing, there is drumming, there is the rattle, the water drum, the smell of sage and cedar. There is also a significant amount of sitting very still with your own thoughts, which is, depending on your relationship with your own thoughts, either deeply meaningful or deeply inconvenient. Peyote in this context is not consumed as a recreational experiment. It is received as a sacrament in a structured, communal, ceremonially held space that has developed over centuries specifically to support the experience. The role of the road chief, the ceremony leader, is to guide, protect, and hold the container of the night. People bring prayers, intentions, grief, illness, confusion. They leave, typically at dawn, having passed through something that doesn't fit neatly into any framework they had before they arrived. The teepee or meeting house where the ceremony is held is itself a cosmological map. The fire at the centre is both literal and symbolic. It is maintained throughout the night by a firekeeper, whose job is one of the most demanding in the ceremony. The crescent-shaped altar of earth is called the moon, and the peyote chief button, the largest and most beautiful available, is placed at its centre. The path of the ceremony circles the fire, follows the arc of the moon, and mirrors the path of the sun across the sky. Nothing about the ceremonial structure is arbitrary. It has been refined by generations of practitioners into a container precise enough to hold the most difficult human material. The singing during a peyote meeting is unlike anything in Western musical tradition. Songs are passed from the road chief to other singers in a specific order, moving clockwise around the circle. Each song is short, melodically tight, sung rapidly, and accompanied by the water drum, a small kettle drum tuned by adjusting the water inside it, and the rattle. The songs don't resolve in the way Western music resolves. They cycle and repeat in patterns that, to an outside ear, sound hypnotic. To participants, they're understood as active ceremonial technology, specific songs for specific purposes, sung at specific times of the night for specific reasons. There are 4 major transitions in the ceremony: midnight water, morning water, sunrise, and the concluding meal. At midnight, a water woman brings in a bucket of water that the road chief blesses and passes around the circle. The ceremony deepens after midnight. The pre-dawn hours between 2 and 4 in the morning are typically described as the most intense, the time when the peyote is at its fullest effect and when the most significant experiences tend to occur. Visions, prayers answered or deepened, moments of clarity, confrontations with grief or fear or gratitude, all of it happening in the flickering firelight while the singing continues and the drum maintains its heartbeat pulse. Dawn arrives slowly, and with it a quality of arrival that participants describe as profound, the sense of having travelled somewhere and returned, of having brought something back that matters. The morning meal, corn, meat, fruit, water, is consumed in silence or in quiet conversation. People are different from how they were at sunset. Not dramatically, not always obviously, but in ways that tend to persist. The ceremony doesn't offer resolution the way a movie does, with a clear ending and the lights coming up. It offers something more like orientation, a recalibration of what matters and where you are in relation to it. Mescaline's taller, friendlier, easier to find cousin. San Pedro cactus, known in Peru as huachuma, is a towering columnar cactus that grows freely across the Andes and with considerable irony in garden centres worldwide, where it is sold as an ornamental plant by vendors who may or may not be fully aware of its ceremonial history. It contains mescaline in lower concentrations than peyote, but enough, and it is considerably easier to cultivate and process, which is why it has become the mescaline source of choice for traditional Andean healers, and, in recent years, for Westerners seeking the experience outside of the Native American church context. The San Pedro trip is frequently described as more expansive and flowing than psilocybin, with strong visual elements but a particular quality that users describe as earthly, connected to landscape, to the body, to the physical world rather than pulling you inward and inward until the physical world stops existing. Practitioners of traditional Andean medicine called curanderos work with San Pedro in healing ceremonies called mesas, using it diagnostically and therapeutically, reading what the medicine reveals about where illness lives in a person's spirit, body and story. Archaeological evidence of San Pedro use in the Andes dates back at least 3,000 years. Textile fragments, carved stone figures, and iconographic depictions from pre-Incan cultures suggest that the cactus has been at the centre of Andean healing traditions for a very long time. The Chavin de Huanta site in Peru, occupied approximately 3,000 years ago, contains stone carvings showing anthropomorphic figures holding what appears to be San Pedro. The cactus is woven into the archaeology of the region, the way certain plants are woven into the medicine of every ancient culture, thoroughly, practically, with an intimacy that suggests not casual experimentation, but a long and careful working relationship. The mesa ceremony of the northern Peruvian coast is one of the most complex healing rituals still actively practiced in the Americas. A curandero's mesa is a cloth or table covered with objects, carved staffs, shells, stones, pre-Columbian artifacts, Catholic icons, arranged in a specific cosmological order that reflects the curandero's lineage, training, and working relationship with different spiritual forces. The ceremony takes place at night, outdoors if possible, and involves singing, prayer, chanting of specific healing formulas, and the administration of San Pedro to both the healer and the patient. The curandero uses the medicine to perceive the patient's condition, to see, in the expanded state, what ordinary diagnosis cannot access. What participants in Andean San Pedro ceremonies most commonly report is a quality of connection to the earth, to other people, to the landscape itself, which comes alive in a way that is not threatening but welcoming. Where ayahuasca is often described as pulling you inward into dark and difficult territory, San Pedro is described as opening you outward into the world, a kind of perceptual hospitality, an expansion rather than a descent. Visions tend toward the natural, mountains, rivers, light on water, the texture of living things. Emotional material surfaces but gently. Insights arrive, but as realizations rather than confrontations. The quality most consistently attributed to San Pedro, across both indigenous and contemporary accounts, is heart-opening. It is described as a medicine that does not demand entry but invites it, that creates the conditions for emotional access without forcing it. In a landscape of psychedelics that range from the gently interesting to the cosmically overwhelming, San Pedro occupies the territory of the profound and the warm. It is, by many accounts, the one that makes you feel most clearly that you are on Earth, and that Earth is good, which sounds unremarkable until you realize how rarely most people feel that specific thing, and how much it turns out to matter. One of the most commonly misunderstood aspects of psychedelic experiences is the nature of the visual component. Popular culture has settled on a cartoon version, colours dripping, walls melting, cartoon trails behind moving hands, and while some of those elements exist, the actual phenomenology of psychedelic vision is considerably more varied and in many ways more interesting than the neon poster version. At low doses, the visuals are enhancement. Colours seem more saturated, textures more alive, light more dimensional. Shadows have depth. Leaves on a tree look individually distinct rather than blending into a general tree shape. This is pleasant. At moderate doses, you move into what researchers call closed-eye visuals, complex geometric patterns, fractals, rotating structures that appear when you close your eyes and that have no relationship to anything you are looking at. These are generated internally by the visual cortex doing something it doesn't normally do. The geometric patterns that appear with eyes closed at moderate doses have been documented and classified. They tend to follow specific forms, lattices, tunnels, spirals, fractals that elaborate themselves into ever greater complexity. Researcher Heinrich Klüver in the 1920s identified 4 basic form constants that appeared across psychedelic experiences regardless of the substance or the individual. Tunnels, spirals, lattices, and cobwebs. These are not arbitrary hallucinations. They appear to reflect the underlying architecture of the visual cortex itself, the specific way that neurons involve the primary visual area, fire when normal input processing is disrupted. In other words, what you see when you close your eyes on a psychedelic may be, to some extent, a direct visual representation of your own neural activity, your brain showing you itself. At higher doses, the visual experience with eyes open becomes more complex. This is where melting and breathing surfaces come from. The visual cortex is processing incoming information with altered parameters, generating movement and pattern in things that are physically still. Objects retain their identity. A chair is still a chair, but their surfaces become animated, their edges less definite, their relationship to surrounding space more fluid. Depth perception changes. Colours shift in hue and saturation, sometimes dramatically. The overall effect is of a world that has become less fixed, less final, as though the usual confident rendering of the visual field has been replaced by something more provisional, more alive, more aware of its own constructedness. At very high doses, particularly with psilocybin and LSD, the visual field can undergo what's called geometric overlay, intricate, self-similar, rapidly evolving patterns superimposed over the ordinary visual world. Objects retain their form, but are now embedded in a field of active geometric information that the brain is generating in response to the altered state. This is not seeing things that aren't there in the way that pathological hallucination is. experienced users consistently describe the ability to distinguish between the intrinsic geometry and the physical world, even while both are simultaneously present. It is more like having a second visual layer switch on, one that normally stays off. Synesthesia, the crossing of sensory pathways, is frequently reported at moderate and high doses. Sound becomes visual, music produces colours, shapes, spatial forms that move with the music structure. Touch can produce visual response. This is the I can see the music experience that sounds like a cliché until it happens, at which point it stops being a cliché and becomes something you spend considerable time afterward trying to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It turns out the senses are, at some deep level of neural processing, not as separate as they present themselves. Psychedelics remove the separation. What remains is something that most people find beautiful. Of all the phenomena associated with high-dose psychedelic experiences, ego dissolution is probably the most discussed and the least adequately named. Ego dissolution sounds like something that happens politely, perhaps like a tablet dissolving in water. What it actually refers to is the experience of the sense of self, the continuous narrating I that you've been running since you were old enough to say I, temporarily ceasing to function as a unified thing. This can happen partially, producing a strange doubling sensation, like watching yourself think from a slight distance. Or it can happen completely, in what researchers call a complete mystical experience, a state in which there is no longer a you observing the experience, because the distinction between observer and observed has dissolved, and what remains is something that defies description, but that people consistently describe with notable frequency as the most meaningful experience of their lives, comparable only to the birth of a child or a near-death experience. This self, as experienced in ordinary life, is not a simple thing. It is a construction, a collection of memories, beliefs, narratives, and patterns maintained continuously by the brain, updated constantly, experienced as continuous but actually assembled moment to moment from a remarkable number of moving parts. The brain is extraordinarily good at this. The sense of being a unified, continuous self feels as natural and as obvious as anything could feel, because we've never known anything else, and because the brain is excellent at hiding its own mechanism from you. Psychedelics, particularly at high doses, disrupt this mechanism. The construction continues, but the seams become visible, and then the seams widen, and then, at sufficient dose, the construction stops, and what's left is experience without an experiencer, sensation, thought, awareness, without the usual organizer. People describe this in ways that are consistent across cultures, eras, and prior belief systems. It is described as unity, the sense that the boundary between self and world, between self and other, has dissolved, and that everything is, on some fundamental level, the same thing. It is described as vastness, the sense of existing at a scale that the ordinary self could not contain. It is described as timelessness, the sense that the usual sequential flow of past, present, and future has become simultaneous, or irrelevant, or both. And it is described, repeatedly and across traditions, as more real than ordinary experience, as though the self was a narrowing of something, and its temporary dissolution reveals what it was narrowing. The difficult version of ego dissolution is not difficult, because the experience is bad in the ordinary sense. It is difficult because it involves losing the thing you most rely on to manage experience, the self, losing the ability to locate yourself in a room, in a timeline, in a narrative. There is no one to reassure because the one who usually reassures is temporarily gone. There is just the experience, proceeding without a manager. This is, depending on your relationship with control, either liberating or terrifying, and the difference between those two outcomes has a great deal to do with whether you are prepared, supported, and willing. The return of the self after a complete dissolution experience is described as one of the most interesting moments of the entire process. The self reassembles, the narrator returns. You're once again a person in a room with a name and a history, and the first thing many people notice immediately upon return is how constructed it feels, how much more apparent the mechanism is than it was before. You're still yourself, completely. But you now know, from direct experience rather than conceptual understanding, that yourself is something the brain is doing, not something the brain is. There is a specific cluster of subjective experiences associated with high-dose psilocybin in particular that researchers at Johns Hopkins and NYU, running carefully designed clinical trials in the 2000s and 2010s, found themselves describing in language they had not expected to use. Words like noetic, the sense that one has received genuine knowledge, not just information but something that feels like truth with a capital T. Words like sacred, eternal, unified. The mystical experience. Questionnaire, a validated psychological instrument used in these studies, measures qualities like a sense of unity with all things, a sense of the sacredness of the experience, deeply felt positive mood, a sense of encountering something that is ultimately real and a paradoxical quality, something that is both impossible to describe and yet somehow more clear than ordinary experience. What the Johns Hopkins research found was that a single high-dose psilocybin session conducted in a carefully held clinical setting produced lasting increases in the personality trait of openness. In some cases, changes large enough that they fell outside the normal range of what personality is supposed to do in adulthood. The mystical experience questionnaire was not designed by mystics. It was designed by psychologists, drawing on the work of William James, Walter Stace, and others who attempted in the early 20th century to catalogue the common features of mystical experiences across religious traditions. What they found, working from first-person accounts in Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist and indigenous traditions, was a remarkable consistency, the same features appearing across cultures, centuries, and theological frameworks. Ego dissolution, unity with everything, a sense of absolute reality, noetic quality, deep peace. These features appeared whether the person was a medieval Christian mystic, a Sufi poet, or a Buddhist monk, and they appear in the psychedelic clinical trials in almost identical form. The researchers are careful not to draw metaphysical conclusions from this, but the consistency is there. What makes the mystical experience clinically interesting, beyond its inherent strangeness, is its apparent therapeutic power. In the Johns Hopkins cancer anxiety studies, the mystical experience score was the strongest predictor of positive therapeutic outcome, more predictive than the total dose, more predictive than prior mental health history, more predictive than almost anything else measured. Participants who scored highest on mystical experience dimensions showed the greatest reductions in anxiety and depression. This finding has replicated across multiple studies and institutions, which is unusual in a field where replication is difficult. The implication, stated carefully with appropriate hedging, in peer-reviewed journals is that something about the mystical experience itself, the dissolution, the sense of unity, the noetic quality, the encounter with something that feels ultimately real, is producing the therapeutic effect, not just the trip in general, not just the psilocybin. The specific content of the experience, the mystical component, is doing the clinical work. For a scientific field that has spent considerable energy maintaining a firm boundary between neuroscience and theology, this finding is, to put it gently, an interesting challenge. The scientists themselves handle this with a precision that is almost amusing to observe. They are not saying God is real. They are not endorsing any religious framework. They are saying that experiences with these specific measurable features correlate with specific measurable positive outcomes, and that this correlation is robust and replicating. The experience feels sacred. Feeling sacred has clinical effect. The scientists measure both, the interpretation they leave to you. Ketamine occupies a strange position in the psychedelic landscape. It's a dissociative anesthetic that was approved for medical use in 1970, is still used as a surgical anesthetic around the world, and has, in recent years, received FDA approval for treatment-resistant depression in a nasal spray formulation called esketamine. It is also, at higher doses, capable of producing one of the most thoroughly disorienting experiences available to the human nervous system. At low doses, the kind used in clinical depression treatment, ketamine produces a floaty, detached, mildly dreamy state. Things feel somewhat unreal. Your body feels somewhat remote. Time slows, but pleasantly. This is the shallow end. At moderate doses, you begin to dissociate more significantly. The body feels very far away. The room looks flattened or distant, and your thoughts take on a kaleidoscopic quality that can be either fascinating or alarming, depending entirely on your current relationship with uncertainty. Ketamine works differently from the classic psychedelics. Rather than acting primarily on serotonin receptors, it blocks NMDA receptors, glutamate receptors involved in memory, learning, and the maintenance of neural connections. This mechanism is why ketamine works so rapidly as an antidepressant. Within hours of a single infusion, many patients with treatment-resistant depression report significant symptom relief. Traditional antidepressants take weeks. Ketamine takes hours. The scientific explanation involves something called synaptogenesis, the rapid growth of new synaptic connections. But the clinical reality is simply that people who have been depressed for years, for whom nothing has worked, receive a ketamine infusion and report feeling within a day genuinely better. The subjective experience of a ketamine infusion in a clinical setting is described as floating, dreamlike, and accompanied by visual phenomena that are softer and more abstract than those of classic psychedelics, less geometric precision, more impressionistic flow. Patients frequently describe a sense of perspective on their lives that feels inaccessible in ordinary consciousness, the ability to see patterns, beliefs, and stories from a distance that makes them more tractable. Some describe experiences that resemble those of classic psychedelics, dissolution of the ordinary self, encounters with imagery that feel significant, a quality of insight that arrives as knowing rather than thinking. The duration is short compared to classic psychedelics. The peak of an intravenous infusion lasts 30 to 45 minutes, with after effects persisting for a few hours. This makes it practically appealing for clinical use. It fits into a medical appointment. It can be monitored. It ends reliably. The ketamine therapy model, now offered through hundreds of clinics across the United States and elsewhere, typically involves a series of infusions over several weeks, combined with psychotherapy to help patients integrate the perspective and relief that the infusions provide. The shadow side of ketamine is its potential for compulsive use. Unlike classic psychedelics, which most people find psychologically difficult to repeat frequently, and which don't produce obvious physical withdrawal, ketamine is habituating for some people. The dreamy, floating quality is pleasant in a way that creates a pull toward repetition. Chronic, high-dose ketamine use is associated with severe bladder damage and with a cognitive profile that researchers describe, with some concern, as a pattern of disconnection from ordinary life rather than enhancement of it. The clinical dose and the recreational dose are very different things. The anesthesiologist explaining the former is correct to describe it as a medicine. The distinction matters. The K-hole is not a medical term. It is a colloquial term used by people who have had a certain kind of ketamine experience, specifically a high-dose experience in which dissociation becomes so complete that ordinary reality stops being available. You don't see the room anymore. You don't feel the chair. You don't have a strong sense of having a body. What you do have is an experience that people describe in varying ways, some as peaceful, womb-like, and strangely restorative, others as confusing, disorienting, and faintly terrifying. The K-hole is not dangerous in a physical sense, assuming you're in a safe environment where you cannot wander into traffic, but it is a category of experience that is difficult to prepare for because the usual strategies for managing your mental state, remembering where you are, focusing on your breath, looking at something familiar, stop working when the room has temporarily ceased to exist as an accessible location. You're simply somewhere else, waiting for the duration to pass, which it will, because ketamine at recreational doses is short-acting, and the K-hole has a beginning, a middle, and an end. What the K-hole actually is, phenomenologically, is debated. The most common description is of a space, not a visual space necessarily, but an experiential one that is vast, dark, empty, and somehow comfortable, despite being completely alien to anything in ordinary experience. The word that comes up most frequently in K-hole accounts is void, not in the terrifying nihilistic sense, but in a sense that resembles descriptions of deep meditative states or near-death experiences. A quiet, expansive nothing in which the usual noise of selfhood has been switched off. The body, during a K-hole, is fully present in the physical space and fully absent from the experiential one. This dissociation is the NMDA mechanism at work. The brain is no longer successfully integrating sensory input from the body with its higher level processing. The result is an experience in which you and your body seem to have temporarily separated, which sounds alarming and, for some people, is. For others, particularly those who carry significant physical or emotional pain, this separation is described as relief. The body and its history briefly become irrelevant. What remains is whatever you are without those things, and the question of what that is turns out to be surprisingly interesting. The return from a K-hole is gradual, and unlike the return from a DMT experience, not abrupt. The room reassembles slowly. The body becomes present again, returning from the periphery. Thoughts begin to form in the usual sequential way. There is frequently a period of several minutes where you're present enough to know you are back, but not yet fully coherent, a comfortable liminal state that many people describe as one of the nicest parts of the experience. And then you're back, completely, sitting in whatever chair you were sitting in, and the room is exactly where you left it, and you spend the next few minutes trying to decide how to describe where you went. Most people settle on somewhere very quiet, which is both accurate and completely insufficient. Regular ketamine users develop what might be called K-hole literacy, an ability to navigate the state without the fear that novelty produces in those encountering it for the first time. Experienced users describe entering the K-hole with intention, using the dissociation as a kind of forced meditation, a removal from the self and its circumstances that allows for a quality of rest or perspective that ordinary consciousness resists. Whether this constitutes spiritual practice, self-medication, or recreational use depends on whom you ask, and frankly on whether the person asking prefers their altered states to come with clinical paperwork. MDMA 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine, in case you'd like to say that 3 times fast, is not classified as a classic psychedelic in the technical sense. It doesn't primarily work on the serotonin 2A receptor the way psilocybin and LSD do. Instead, it floods the brain with serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin simultaneously, producing an experience characterized by profound emotional warmth, empathy, a deep reduction in fear response, and a feeling of emotional safety so thorough that therapists have been investigating it as a treatment for PTSD for decades. In therapeutic doses, MDMA does not typically produce strong visual hallucinations. What it does produce is emotional openness at a scale that most people have not experienced since early childhood, a genuine absence of defensive armor, combined with the cognitive ability to examine difficult memories without being overwhelmed by them. The reason therapists found this interesting should be obvious. The reason the FDA designated it a breakthrough therapy for PTSD in 2017 also becomes obvious. MDMA was first synthesized by the Merck Pharmaceutical Company in 1912 and sat unnoticed in a filing cabinet for 6 decades, which is either a great shame or a fitting metaphor for how the 20th century handled emotional complexity. It was rediscovered in the 1970s by chemist Alexander Shulgin, who synthesized it himself and shared it with therapists including Leo Zeff, who quietly introduced it to hundreds of therapists across the United States throughout the 1980s as a tool for facilitating therapeutic breakthroughs. Before MDMA was scheduled in 1985, over the objections of the therapists using it, it had been used in private therapeutic practice for years with outcomes that practitioners described as remarkable. Therapeutic work that typically required months or years of careful relationship building could be accomplished in a single session. Patients who'd been unable to access traumatic material could suddenly discuss it with clarity and without being re-traumatized. The mechanism is central to this. In ordinary therapeutic work, trauma is difficult to access because the fear response is connected to the traumatic memory. When you get close to it, the alarm goes off and you retreat. MDMA reduces the activity of the amygdala while maintaining cognitive function, producing a state in which the alarm is quiet and the memory is accessible. You can look at the traumatic material from a position of safety rather than threat. You can discuss it, process it, and integrate it in a way that the fear response normally prevents. This is not the same as numbing. The emotional content is fully present. The difference is that you can be with it rather than overwhelmed by it. The recreational MDMA experience, in the absence of therapeutic context, typically involves profound feelings of connection with other people, heightened sensory experience, particularly of music and touch, and an unusual degree of emotional transparency. Things that are normally difficult to say become easy. Connections between people are felt deeply. Music acquires a physical, all-encompassing quality. This is the rave drug, the festival drug, the one that generated an entire subculture around the particular quality of collective emotional openness it produces. The shadow side is the come down, the 2 to 4 day period after use when serotonin levels are depleted, producing fatigue, irritability, and a flatness of affect that is the neurochemical opposite of the experience itself. The recovery period is real, and it is roughly proportional to how intensely the experience was pursued, which is a lesson the brain is communicating very clearly. Before Albert Hofmann bicycled through Basel, before Timothy Leary was on the cover of any magazine, before any Western researcher wrote any paper about mystical experiences or personality trait changes, indigenous cultures across the Americas, Africa, and Asia had developed sophisticated, structured, ceremonially held relationships with psychedelic plants that had been refined over centuries or millennia. The peyote traditions of the Huichol people of Mexico, the ayahuasca traditions of dozens of Amazonian nations, the ceremonial use of psilocybin mushrooms by Mazatec healers in Oaxaca, where the curandera Maria Sabina held veladas, all-night healing mushroom ceremonies, decades before anyone in the Western world had heard the word psilocybin. These weren't experiments, they weren't recreational events, They were healthcare systems, complex, ritual-embedded, experienced healer-guided processes for addressing illness of the spirit, the body, and the community. The Western scientific rediscovery of psychedelics borrowed freely from these traditions. The debt, often unacknowledged, is considerable. Maria Sabina is perhaps the most famous example of what Western culture has repeatedly done with indigenous psychedelic knowledge: encounter it, extract what it wants from it, and credit the extraction while overlooking the source. Sabina was a Mazatec curandera in the mountain village of Huautla de Jimenez, Oaxaca, who'd been conducting veladas, night-long healing mushroom ceremonies, for decades when ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson arrived in 1955, attended a ceremony, and wrote about it in Life magazine in 1957 under the title Seeking the Magic Mushroom. His account reached millions of readers and initiated the Western fascination with psilocybin that led, eventually, to the clinical trials of today. Sabina opened her ceremonies to Wasson in good faith, as a healer. What followed, in her own accounts, was a cascade of unwanted visitors, tourists, researchers, celebrities that disrupted her community, overwhelmed her practice, and ultimately left her isolated and impoverished. She's described by contemporary researchers as foundational to the psychedelic renaissance. She died in 1985, largely forgotten by the culture whose curiosity she had sparked. The Huichol, who call themselves the Wixaritari, have maintained a continuous peyote pilgrimage tradition for centuries. The pilgrimage to Wirikuta, the sacred desert homeland of peyote, involves a journey of hundreds of kilometers on foot, undertaken annually, in which participants are ritually transformed into ancestral beings. The peyote encountered at Wirikuta is not consumed recreationally. It is received as the dear god, Kauyumari, the guide and protector of the journey. This is not metaphor within the tradition. It is cosmology, medicine, and history simultaneously. The Huichol have resisted incursions on Wirikuta, including mining operations that threaten the land where peyote grows, with the same seriousness with which any people defend a sacred site, because that is precisely what it is. The knowledge that indigenous traditions accumulated about psychedelic plants, about preparation, about ceremony, about contraindications, about the role of the healer, about integration, took generations to develop. Modern psychedelic research, in its most rigorous and responsible forms, has acknowledged this debt explicitly. Researchers at MAPS at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere have emphasized the importance of indigenous knowledge to the development of their protocols. But acknowledgement and actual engagement are different things, and the broader cultural conversation about psychedelics still tends to center Western researchers, Western therapeutics, and Western frameworks, while the traditions from which they learned remain underrepresented in their own story. The phrase bad trip has a specific cultural meaning. Something went wrong, it was scary, avoid at all costs. And there are absolutely experiences under psychedelics that are genuinely frightening, confusing, destabilizing, and unpleasant from beginning to end. That's real. But researchers and therapists working in this space have increasingly distinguished between an experience that is simply difficult and one that is actively harmful, and those two categories overlap less than you'd think. Difficult experiences on psychedelics frequently involve confronting things that are genuinely uncomfortable, grief that hasn't been processed, anxieties that have been successfully avoided, aspects of yourself you've been politely ignoring. This is not pleasant. But many people who have had what they would, at the time, describe as terrible experiences report months or years later that those experiences were among the most important of their lives, not because the difficulty was fun, but because something that needed to surface did. The term researchers have settled on for this is challenging experience rather than bad trip. The distinction matters. The difficult psychedelic experience tends to follow a pattern. There is a moment, typically at the peak, when the usual tools of self-management are least available, when material surfaces that the person would strongly prefer not to be encountering. Fear, grief, shame, the specific texture of an anxiety that has been successfully suppressed for years, the face of someone you have unfinished business with, the awareness of a pattern in your life that you've been not quite looking at. This is the moment that people describe as the bad trip beginning. And the standard advice from traditional practitioners and clinical guides alike is almost always the same. Stop fighting it. Open to it. Trust that what is surfacing needs to surface. This advice is much easier to give than to follow when you're 4 hours into a high-dose psychedelic experience and the room appears to be breathing, and something you would not describe as a happy feeling has arrived and does not appear to be leaving. But the clinical evidence for it is consistent. Resistance to difficult material during a psychedelic experience tends to intensify the difficulty, while acceptance, allowing the material to surface, moving toward it rather than away, tends to resolve it, often rapidly. This is the same principle underlying exposure therapy, trauma processing, and many contemplative traditions. The thing you are afraid of does not get smaller when you avoid it. There is a category of psychedelic experience that goes beyond the challenging into the genuinely traumatic. Experiences of overwhelming terror, complete loss of orientation, paranoia that persist beyond the pharmacological window, or psychological destabilization that lasts days or weeks. These are real, and they are more likely in certain conditions, at very high doses, in unprepared individuals, in unsupportive settings, in people with underlying vulnerabilities, particularly personal or family history of psychosis. This is not a hypothetical risk. Psychiatric emergency presentations related to psychedelic use exist. The substances are not for everyone, not in all contexts, not at all doses. This is consistent with the way every serious practitioner and researcher in the field talks about them, as powerful tools that require respect, preparation, and appropriate context, not as universally safe substances that require only good intentions. The psychedelic experience is 6 hours. The integration is the rest of your life, or at least a significant portion of the next several months. Integration is the word used in both therapeutic and traditional contexts to describe the process of making meaning from what happened. Taking the insights, the difficult material, the visions, the emotions, the revelations, and actually doing something with them in the day-to-day world you return to, where your laundry is still in the dryer, and your inbox is still full, and the traffic on the way to work is still entirely unreasonable. Integration is where the work actually lives. Without it, even a profound experience tends to fade back into the ordinary background of daily life, leaving behind a vague sense that something important happened, and a frustrating inability to access what that was. This is not a failure of the medicine. It's a reflection of how the human mind metabolizes experience, not instantly, but gradually, through conversation, reflection, journaling, therapy, and the slow work of actually changing how you live. The days immediately following a significant psychedelic experience have a particular quality that is worth noting. There is frequently an afterglow, a heightened emotional sensitivity, a greater awareness of beauty, a reduced defensiveness, an unusual access to gratitude. This is real and neurochemically supported, related to the window of neural plasticity that psychedelics appear to open. It is also temporary. The afterglow tends to last days to a week. What it represents is an opportunity, a period during which the brain is more receptive to new patterns, new ways of relating to oneself and the world. Integration work done during this window tends to be more effective than work done after the ordinary defensive structures have reassembled. What does integration actually look like in practice? It looks like journaling, writing down what happened, what it meant, what questions it raised, what you want to do differently. It looks like therapy with a therapist who understands psychedelic experiences and won't pathologize what you're describing. It looks like conversations with people you trust about the material that surfaced. It looks, most importantly, like actual behavioral change, making the phone call you've been avoiding, beginning the practice you committed to, ending the relationship or beginning the conversation, or taking the step that the experience pointed toward and that you've been finding reasons to postpone. The insights are real. Insights without action are just interesting memories. This is the most mundane sentence in the entire psychedelic literature, and it is also the most important one. One of the consistent findings from follow-up interviews with participants in clinical psilocybin studies is that the people whose lives changed most significantly after a session are not necessarily the people who had the most intense or dramatic experiences. They are the people who did the most integration work afterward. They showed up to their follow-up therapy sessions. They made specific commitments and kept them. They talked about what surfaced rather than filing it under that weird thing that happened. The correlation between integration effort and lasting positive outcome is consistent enough that researchers have begun designing specific integration interventions, structured curricula for the weeks after a session, as carefully as they design the session itself. Traditional ceremonial contexts have always understood this. Indigenous healing traditions build integration into the ceremony itself. The songs continue after the peak. The container holds the person through the difficult territory and back. The community is present for the morning meal and the quiet conversations that follow. The ceremony doesn't end when the medicine wears off. It ends when the person is back, oriented, and held. Modern psychedelic therapy is attempting to replicate this, not perfectly, not fully, but with enough understanding of the principle to know that the hours after the session matter as much as the hours during it. The medicine opens something. Integration is the work of deciding what to do with the open door, and that work, unlike the experience itself, does not have a time limit. Microdosing, taking a subperceptual dose of a psychedelic, typically psilocybin or LSD, on a regular schedule, became a cultural phenomenon in the 2010s, primarily through reports from tech workers in San Francisco who described improvements in creativity, focus, emotional resilience, and general quality of life. The doses involved are specifically designed not to produce any noticeable perceptual alteration, typically 1/10 to 1/20th of a full dose, taken every third day according to protocols developed most famously by researcher James Fadiman. The anecdotal reports were striking enough that researchers began designing clinical trials. The results of those trials have been, to put it charitably, mixed. Some studies show subjective benefit, others find effects indistinguishable from placebo. What the research has pretty consistently shown is that expectancy, what you believe the substance will do, plays an enormous role, large enough that it's genuinely difficult to separate from the pharmacological effect at subperceptual doses. This does not mean microdosing doesn't work. It means the science is still catching up to the cultural enthusiasm. The anecdotal literature on microdosing is extensive and, in aggregate, consistent in certain features. Regular microdoses describe increased emotional stability, reduced anxiety, greater creativity and lateral thinking, and an enhanced ability to be present in ordinary activities. They describe a quality of engagement with their work and their relationships that feels slightly elevated above baseline, not euphoric, not noticeably altered, but better in the way that feeling good is better than feeling okay, without being a dramatic difference. This is compelling testimony, and there is a lot of it. The problem scientifically is that this description is also almost exactly what you'd expect from the placebo effect in people who very much want something to work, especially if the something costs money, requires effort, and is culturally loaded with positive associations. The most rigorous study to date on microdosing, published in the journal eLife in 2022 by researchers at Imperial College London, used what's called a self-blinding protocol, in which participants prepared their own microdoses and placebos, and then randomized which one they took without being told which was which. The results found improvements in psychological well-being in both the microdosing and placebo groups during the study period, with some measures slightly favouring the active drug and others not. The most notable finding was that people's pre-study expectations strongly predicted their outcomes. People who expected benefit tended to report it, regardless of whether they were actually taking the substance or the placebo. This is not a reason to dismiss microdosing. Placebo effects are real effects. They involve actual neurological changes, actual symptom relief, actual behavioural shifts. If the ritual of microdosing, the discipline it requires, the attention it encourages, the intention it embodies, produces genuine benefit, that benefit is real whether or not the pharmacology is contributing. The responsible conclusion is simply that we don't yet know with confidence how much of microdosing's reported benefit is pharmacological, and how much is the human mind's remarkable ability to improve when it believes it is being helped. Further research is ongoing. The answer will be more complicated than either the enthusiasts or the skeptics currently prefer. Among the most genuinely interesting contributions of the recent wave of psychedelic neuroscience research is the story of the default mode network, a collection of brain regions that becomes active when you're not focused on anything specific, when you're mind-wandering, self-referencing, ruminating, and constructing and reinforcing your ongoing narrative of who you are. The default mode network is, in a loose sense, the neural substrate of the I, the sense of self, and what brain imaging studies of psilocybin and LSD have consistently shown is that these substances substantially reduce activity in the default mode network. The regions that usually anchor your sense of separate selfhood go quiet, and as they do, the connectivity between brain regions that don't normally talk to each other increases dramatically, a state that neuroscientist Robin Carhart-Harris has described as neural entropy, a kind of ordered chaos in which the brain's usual signal processing hierarchies temporarily loosen, allowing for unusual associations, perspectives, and experiences. The mystical experience of unity, the insights that feel revelatory, the visuals that shouldn't exist, all of it, in some measure, traceable to a network that temporarily stopped insisting on the usual story. The default mode network was only discovered and named in the early 2000s, when researchers noticed that a consistent set of brain regions became active during rest, when subjects were lying in the scanner with nothing to do and deactivated during tasks that required focused attention. This was unexpected. The brain was using more energy, not less, when it appeared to be doing nothing. What it was doing, during that apparently idle time, was running its most persistent program, the self, maintaining the narrative, replaying memories, planning futures, evaluating social situations, running the model of who you are and how the world relates to you. The default mode network is the brain on autopilot, and it is extremely active. Depression, anxiety, and addiction all show characteristic patterns of overactive default mode network function. In depression, the network runs ruminative loops, the same painful self-referential thoughts cycling repeatedly. In anxiety, it runs anticipatory threat models, running scenarios of future suffering with impressive thoroughness. In addiction, It runs craving-related self-narrative. The default mode network, in pathological states, is doing too much of what it normally does, and the result is suffering. This is where the therapeutic implications of psychedelic-induced default mode suppression become particularly interesting. When the default mode network goes quiet under psilocybin or LSD, those ruminative loops lose their grip. The rigid, over-practiced narrative of self that characterizes depression becomes temporarily unavailable. The result is not emptiness. The rest of the brain is still doing things, and those things produce the vivid, connective, unusual experience of the psychedelic state. But the specific quality of stuck, self-referential, looping misery that is depression's characteristic texture simply cannot persist in a brain where the network responsible for generating it has been substantially suppressed. This is one coherent explanation for why a single psilocybin session can produce antidepressant effects that last weeks or months. The default mode network, temporarily suppressed, may return to activity in slightly different patterns, with slightly loosened grooves, leaving less room for the ruts that suffering runs in. In 2022, a landmark study published in the New England Journal of Medicine compared psilocybin-assisted therapy directly against escitalopram, a standard antidepressant in patients with moderate to severe depression. This was not a fringe study. This was a randomized, controlled, double-blind trial at Imperial College London, the most rigorous design available. The results were, as researchers are trained to describe things, interesting. Both treatments reduced depression scores significantly. Psilocybin did not statistically outperform escitalopram on the primary measure, but on secondary measures, emotional processing, feelings of well-being, the ability to cry, to feel joy, to feel connected to other people, psilocybin showed advantages. And critically, the psilocybin was administered twice. 2 sessions over the course of a study that lasted 6 weeks. The escitalopram was taken daily for those same 6 weeks. The comparison being drawn, quietly and carefully, is between 2 sessions of a guided psychedelic experience and 6 weeks of daily medication, producing roughly equivalent results, which is, if you sit with it for a moment, a genuinely remarkable finding. The population for whom psilocybin research has shown the most striking results is people with treatment-resistant depression, people for whom multiple antidepressants have failed, for whom the options available in ordinary psychiatry have been exhausted. This is a population for whom the clinical need is acute. Standard antidepressants, which work by gradually adjusting the serotonin system over weeks of daily dosing, simply don't respond in a meaningful proportion of patients. Estimates range from 30 to 50% of people with major depressive disorder failing to achieve adequate response. For this group, psilocybin represents something qualitatively different. Not an adjustment to the serotonin system, but a temporary wholesale disruption of the brain's default processing modes, followed by what appears to be a window of neuroplasticity during which new patterns can form. The patients who participate in these trials are carefully monitored. The psilocybin sessions take place in a clinical room designed for comfort and safety, comfortable furniture, carefully selected music, eye shades for inward focus, 2 trained therapists present throughout. The sessions are preceded by preparatory meetings and followed by integration sessions. The experience is not administered casually, and what the participants describe across studies bears a consistent character, a confrontation with the material underlying their depression, often loss, grief, shame, disconnection, experienced in a context where it can be met rather than overwhelmed, and then, frequently, a quality of release. What psilocybin does not appear to do, and this is important, is numb. The criticism levelled at antidepressants by many patients is precisely this, that they flatten affect, reduce the emotional range, create a muffled quality that reduces suffering, but also reduces joy, connection, and the feeling of being fully alive. In the Imperial College comparison study, the psilocybin group showed advantages on exactly the measures that track this quality. They reported more emotional fluency, more access to grief and to joy both, more sense of connection. The depression reduced not by being suppressed, but by being moved through. This is a different theory of what treating depression means, not managing symptoms, but resolving the underlying material. The research doesn't yet demonstrate that psilocybin achieves this durably and reliably at scale, but it suggests strongly enough that the FDA has designated it a breakthrough therapy, that it achieves it for some people in ways that nothing else currently available can match. There is a specific body of psychedelic research that tends to silence even people who are deeply skeptical about the field. In the mid-2000s, researchers at Johns Hopkins and NYU began administering psilocybin to patients with terminal cancer diagnoses who were experiencing severe anxiety and depression related to their impending deaths. The results were unusual enough that the researchers published them carefully, with significant hedging, because the effect sizes were larger than almost anything seen in psychiatry. A single psilocybin session produced rapid, sustained reductions in anxiety and depression in a majority of participants, reductions that, in some cases, persisted for months and were still measurable at the 6-month follow-up. Participants described the experience as allowing them to encounter death not with terror, but with something closer to acceptance, a sense that whatever they were not limited to the body that was dying. The experiences were rated consistently among the most meaningful of their entire lives. Researchers spent considerable time in their publications noting that these were subjective reports and that they were not making metaphysical claims, but the data sat there, doing its quiet, inconvenient work. The existential suffering that accompanies a terminal diagnosis is a specific and devastating kind of pain. It is not addressable by the same pharmacological tools as ordinary depression and anxiety, not because the mechanisms are different, but because the source is different. There is no drug that makes the fact of death less real, no medication that resolves the particular terror of one's own extinction. Standard palliative psychiatry offers management, sedation, mood stabilization, reduction of acute panic. It does not offer what many dying people actually need, a way to be with what is happening. Psilocybin in these studies appeared to offer precisely that. What participants described in interview after interview was a shift in their relationship to death rather than a reduction in awareness of it. The death was still real. The disease was still real. What changed was the felt sense of what they were in relation to it. Many described experiences of ego dissolution during the psilocybin session, the temporary cessation of the ordinary bounded self, and found that this experience changed how they thought about death. If the self is not as solid and permanent as it usually feels, if the boundary between self and other can be experienced as permeable rather than absolute, then the prospect of the self's dissolution becomes less categorically terrifying, not comfortable, not easy, but different, integrated into a larger context rather than standing alone as a brute fact of annihilation. The researchers' care in presenting these results is itself informative. They did not say that psilocybin shows patients that death is not real, or that there is an afterlife, or that the soul persists. They said that participants reported these experiences and that the experiences correlated with reduced existential distress. The correlation is robust. The experience is what it is. The oncologists who read these papers and went quiet were not presumably converted to any particular metaphysical position. They were confronted with data showing that dying people who received a carefully guided psilocybin session reported dramatically reduced terror of death for months afterward, at a rate and magnitude that no other intervention has replicated. Whether the mechanism is neurological, psychological, spiritual, or some entanglement of all three is a question the data cannot answer. The data can only show what happened to real people facing real deaths, and what happened was, by any standard, remarkable. In 1970, the United States government placed psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and mescaline in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, the most restrictive category, reserved for substances deemed to have no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. This happened approximately at the same time that early clinical research was showing promising results for psychedelic-assisted therapy in alcoholism, existential distress, and depression. The scheduling effectively halted that research for decades. Today, the legal landscape is changing, unevenly and unpredictably. Oregon became the first state to legalize supervised psilocybin services in 2022, though implementation has been slow. Colorado followed in 2022 as well, decriminalizing a broader range of psychedelics. Several cities, including Denver, Oakland, and Washington, D.C., have decriminalized personal possession and use. Internationally, the Netherlands has had legal psilocybin truffles for decades. Jamaica has no law against psilocybin mushrooms and has become a destination for therapeutic retreats. Australia, in 2023, became the first country to formally approve psilocybin and MDMA for use in clinical therapy. The story of how these substances ended up in Schedule 1 is less a story of medical evidence and more a story of political timing. The 1960s counterculture associated psychedelics so thoroughly with anti-war protest, youth rebellion, and cultural disruption that the substances became politically symbolic in ways that made rational assessment nearly impossible. The Nixon administration, which is now extensively documented as having deliberately targeted black people and anti-war protesters through drug policy, included psychedelics in the scheduling decisions that created the Controlled Substances Act. The first director of Nixon's drug enforcement apparatus, John Ehrlichman, stated explicitly in a 1994 interview published after his death that the goal of the drug war was to disrupt and criminalize these communities, and that the administration knew the drugs weren't the point. The clinical evidence was not the deciding factor. The political calculation was. The consequence of Schedule 1 classification for psychedelic research was nearly total. Universities couldn't obtain funding. The DEA controlled the supply of research-grade materials, and obtaining approval was prohibitively difficult. The researchers who had been producing promising results in the 1960s work on alcoholism treatment, on existential anxiety, on the treatment of depression, were effectively shut down. The research that was beginning to show that these substances could address significant therapeutic needs was suspended for approximately 30 years, not because the evidence turned negative, but because the political environment made the work impossible. The current moment of change is remarkable, partly because of how rapidly it is occurring. From the FDA's breakthrough therapy designation for MDMA, assisted therapy for PTSD, to the legalization of supervised psilocybin services in Oregon, to the Australian regulatory approval, all of this has happened in less than a decade. The legal framework is genuinely in flux, with the clinical evidence building faster than the regulatory systems can adapt. What is legal in one city, illegal in the next county, and regulated differently at the state and federal levels, creates a landscape that is genuinely difficult to navigate and that produces significant inequities. Therapeutic access for those who can afford retreats in Jamaica or the Netherlands, while domestic access remains restricted. The map is being redrawn quickly, and it is far from settled. Not every human nervous system is well suited to a psychedelic experience, and this is not a disclaimer tacked on for legal reasons. It is a genuinely important part of understanding these substances. The clearest contraindication is personal or family history of psychosis or schizophrenia. Classic psychedelics, particularly at moderate to high doses, can trigger or exacerbate psychotic episodes in people with genetic vulnerability. And this risk is serious enough that all responsible clinical research excludes anyone with this history. A first-degree relative with schizophrenia is considered sufficient reason to avoid these substances entirely. Certain medications interact with psychedelics in ways ranging from reducing their effectiveness to creating significant physiological risk. Lithium in particular carries a risk of seizures when combined with classic psychedelics. SSR is reduce or block the effects of psilocybin and LSD. MAOIs, which are used in ayahuasca, have extremely dangerous interactions with a wide range of foods and medications, which is why traditional ayahuasca practitioners require dietary restrictions for days before a ceremony. None of this is obscure information. All of it tends to be significantly underemphasized in casual cultural discussions of these substances. The same cultural conversation that spends considerable time on the therapeutic potential of these compounds tends to move quickly past the part where some people should simply not take them, ever, under any framing, regardless of how appealing the retreat brochure looks. Let's be specific about the psychosis risk, because it is frequently misunderstood in both directions, either dismissed entirely by enthusiasts or inflated into a reason to avoid any engagement with the subject. Classic psychedelics do not cause schizophrenia in the general population. Large epidemiological studies have found no association between psychedelic use and increased rates of psychosis or other mental health problems in the overall population. In fact, some studies have found modest associations in the opposite direction. Lower rates of psychological distress in people who have used psychedelics compared to those who haven't. This is the data that enthusiasts cite. The data they sometimes skip is the case series and clinical reports showing that in individuals with personal or family history of psychosis, high-dose psychedelic use has, on multiple documented occasions, triggered psychotic episodes that required hospitalization and, in some cases, did not fully resolve. These are not the majority of psychedelic experiences. They are a real and documented minority, and the people to whom they happen are identifiable in advance, not perfectly, not always, but well enough that every responsible clinical protocol screens for them and excludes them from participation. Beyond the clinical contraindications, there is a category of psychological readiness that practitioners and researchers consistently identify as important. This is harder to define than a medication list, but not less real. Someone in acute crisis, severe depression, active suicidality, recent trauma, relationship in acute dissolution, is not in a position to benefit from a psychedelic experience in the way that a person in relative psychological stability might be. The experience amplifies what is present. If what is present is overwhelming, the amplification is not helpful. This does not mean that people with depression or trauma cannot benefit. The clinical research suggests they can and do. It means that the context, preparation, support, and skill of the guide all need to be appropriately calibrated to the degree of vulnerability. A person with moderate treatment-resistant depression, carefully screened in a well-designed clinical protocol with trained therapists, is a very different situation from the same person, at the same level of suffering, taking a large dose alone at home on a difficult weekend. The substance is the same, the outcomes are likely to be very different. The personality trait of high anxiety, a tendency toward worry, a low tolerance for uncertainty, a strong need for control, is not an absolute contraindication, but it is a significant risk factor for difficult experiences. Psychedelics remove control in a thoroughgoing way. The experience proceeds on its own terms, at its own pace, with its own agenda, and your opinion of that agenda is not consulted. Someone with a very strong need to control their psychological state, who's not done meaningful work around this quality, is likely to find that the removal of control produces significant distress rather than relief. The irony is that many of the people with the most to gain from loosening the grip of an anxious, controlling mind are also the people most likely to have a difficult time doing it. This is not a reason to avoid the substances. It is a reason to prepare seriously, choose context carefully, and be honest about what you're bringing in. Age is a consideration that tends to be underemphasized in popular discourse, which skews toward younger users. Adolescent brains are still developing, particularly in the prefrontal cortex regions that regulate emotion, impulse control, and decision-making. Early life psychedelic use, particularly at high doses or in unsupported contexts, appears from epidemiological evidence to carry greater risks of lasting psychological disruption than use in fully developed adult brains. The same experience that produces meaningful integration in a 40-year-old with life context, therapeutic support, and a stable sense of identity can be destabilizing in a 16-year-old whose identity is still being assembled. This is not about protecting young people from difficult experiences in general. It is about the specific way that these substances interact with a developing brain and the specific vulnerabilities that creates. Conversely, there is growing interest in psychedelic therapy for older adults, particularly for end-of-life concerns and for the treatment of depression in aging populations. The data in these populations is early but promising, and the risk profile appears different, not lower in all respects, but different in ways that make careful, supported use more feasible than in younger populations with more turbulent psychological terrain. The bottom line across all of this is that these are not gentle substances being unnecessarily hedged by cautious institutions. They are powerful tools with real risks that are real for real reasons, and the people who benefit most from them are the people who approach them with the same seriousness they would bring to any powerful intervention, medical, psychological, or otherwise. The enthusiasm in the culture right now is warranted. The casualness is not. The story of how psychedelic research returned to respectability after 3 decades of near-total suppression involves, improbably, a handful of stubborn researchers, several philanthropists willing to fund what no government would touch, and a slow accumulation of results so consistently striking that they became difficult for even skeptical peer reviewers to dismiss. The researcher most responsible for the modern Renaissance is probably Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins, who published his first psilocybin study in 2006, with results that the journal Psychopharmacology accompanied with an editorial asking whether the findings were simply too good to be true. The study showed that a single psilocybin session produced mystical experiences that participants rated among the most meaningful of their lives, and that those ratings were still present at the 14-month follow-up. This was not the kind of result a conservative pharmacology journal expected to publish, but the methodology was rigorous enough that they did, and the effect cascaded outward across the field. Other researchers, who'd been watching from a careful distance, began to move. What had been a fringe area, funded by private money and conducted in the margins of mainstream science, began acquiring the institutional weight of established institutions willing to stake their reputations on it. Griffiths himself had an unusual path to psychedelic research. He had spent decades studying caffeine, nicotine, and sedatives, the ordinary pharmacology of everyday substances, the kind of work that doesn't attract controversy or require special DEA approval, and doesn't produce papers asking whether something is too good to be true. His entry into psilocybin research came through a personal encounter with meditation practice that produced what he later described as a mystical experience, leading him to wonder whether the experiences described in religious literature and contemplative tradition were related to those produced by psychedelics. His curiosity was scientific, but it was informed by personal experience, a combination that has characterized many of the most significant figures in psychedelic research, and that makes certain corners of the pharmacology community quietly uncomfortable, because scientists are not supposed to be personally moved by their subject matter. Griffiths was moved. He did the work anyway, with the rigour of someone who understood exactly how much scrutiny it would attract. The funding landscape for early second-wave research was unusual and is worth understanding. Federal funding, through NIDA and NIMH, was essentially unavailable for research into Schedule I substances as potential therapeutics. The early Johns Hopkins studies were funded by private donors, wealthy individuals who had personal reasons to believe this research mattered and were willing to fund work that no government body would touch. This created a situation where some of the most significant medical research of the 21st century was funded by private philanthropy rather than public health priorities, which is both a reflection of how the scheduling has distorted medical research incentives and a remarkable tribute to the individuals who kept the funding alive. Without them, the research doesn't happen, the clinical trials don't run, the data that is now reshaping psychiatry doesn't get collected. The trajectory of an entire field hangs, somewhat improbably, on a small number of people willing to fund something the government had decided wasn't worth knowing. Rick Doblin and MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, deserve specific mention in any honest account of how this happened. Doblin founded MAPS in 1986, the year after MDMA was scheduled, specifically with the goal of eventually obtaining FDA approval for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. He spent 35 years doing this, not 35 years of comfortable, well-funded institutional research. 35 years of raising money from donors, navigating an extraordinarily hostile regulatory environment, running Phase 1 trials and Phase 2 trials, and eventually Phase 3 trials, building the evidence base in a system that was structurally designed to prevent him from doing so. The Phase 3 trials for MDMA assisted therapy produced results showing 71% of participants no longer meeting the diagnostic criteria for PTSD after treatment, in a population for whom existing treatments had failed, at a rate that no existing pharmacological intervention has matched. The FDA's rejection of the approval application in 2024, citing concerns about trial design rather than the efficacy data, was a setback. It was not a refutation. The data exists. The momentum exists. The field that Doblin spent 35 years building from scratch did not collapse when the FDA said not yet. It simply kept going. What the second wave has produced beyond the specific clinical findings is a broader shift in how the scientific community relates to questions that psychedelics make unavoidable. Questions about consciousness, about what the self is and what happens when it temporarily ceases, about the relationship between brain activity and subjective experience, about what it means for a pharmacological intervention to produce a mystical experience, and for that mystical experience to have measurable therapeutic effect. These are not fringe questions anymore. They are being asked in peer-reviewed journals. They are being funded by major research institutions. They are being taken seriously by exactly the kind of people who would have been quietly embarrassed to be associated with them 15 years ago. The conversation has changed. It has changed because the evidence changed, and the evidence changed because a small number of researchers spent decades doing careful, rigorous, often professionally risky work, while the broader establishment waited to see if they were right. They were right. and the field they built on private money and personal conviction and a succession of results that kept being too good to ignore, is now one of the most active and most watched areas of psychiatric and neuroscientific research in the world. The second wave is not over. It is by most measures still cresting. What it has already established is that the scheduling decision of 1970, made for political rather than scientific reasons, in a context of cultural panic rather than clinical assessment, was, at minimum, a significant delay in the investigation of substances with genuine medical potential. The chapter that said these are not worth studying is definitively closed. What comes next is a question the evidence is still answering, one carefully designed trial at a time. Here is where the sleep history narrator has to be honest with you, because this is the part where the subject matter becomes genuinely difficult to summarize without either overstating or understating it, across all the research, across all the ceremonial traditions, across all the first-person accounts from people who have had experiences they spent years attempting to describe. There is a consistent cluster of what these substances seem to point at. Not uniformly, not predictably, not for every person in every context, but with enough regularity to constitute a pattern. They point at something about the self, specifically the possibility that the bounded, separate, continuous self you experience every day is something like a construction, a useful fiction assembled by a brain doing its best to navigate a complex world, rather than a fixed and final truth about what you are. And they suggest, through direct experience rather than argument, that loosening the grip of that construction, briefly and carefully, might reveal something that feels more fundamental. Whether that something is a neurological artifact, a genuine glimpse of the nature of consciousness, or something else entirely, that question remains wide open, and honestly that might be the most interesting thing about it, not the answer. The fact that the question is being asked at all, in peer-reviewed journals by serious researchers in an era that was supposed to have moved past this kind of uncertainty. The pattern is this. Across the Amazon basin, across the Wakan Mountains, across the Huichol Desert Pilgrimage, across the clinical trials at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College and NYU, the reported core of the experience is consistent. Unity. The dissolution of the usual boundary between self and other. A quality of meaning that saturates the experience from within, that does not need to be interpreted as meaningful because it simply is. And a sense, upon return, that ordinary consciousness is one mode of experience rather than the only one. A Mazatec curandera, a clinical trial participant, and a Huichol elder on pilgrimage are not working from the same cosmology, but they are, with striking frequency, describing the same place. That consistency across wildly different frameworks is not nothing. In any other domain, it would be considered significant evidence that something real is being reported. The therapeutic implications extend beyond any specific clinical indication. If the consistent feature of profound psychedelic experiences is a loosening of the grip of the separate self, and if that rigidity underlies a broad range of suffering, depression, anxiety, addiction, existential fear, the inability to connect with other people, then these substances are not treating specific disorders. They're addressing something more upstream. Standard pharmacology finds a symptom and suppresses it. What psychedelics appear to do in their best-case therapeutic use is find the thing beneath the symptom, the defended self that cannot look at what it needs to look at, and temporarily soften it enough that the person inside it can move. Not forever, not without work, but enough. None of this means they are for everyone. The contraindications are real. The risks of unsupported high-dose use are real. The history of harm done when these substances were stripped of their ceremonial containers and handed to people without preparation belongs in the same story as the history of healing. The culture's current enthusiasm is, in many ways, warranted by the evidence. the tendency to flatten that enthusiasm into a universal recommendation, to skip the preparation and the integration and the context and arrive directly at whatever was ordered online, is the part the evidence does not support, and that every practitioner in every tradition, ancient and modern, would recognize immediately as exactly what they spent centuries of ceremonial structure trying to prevent. What they keep pointing at, regardless of who takes them, regardless of the era, is something the human brain apparently needs reminding of, that the self is not the whole story, that the room is larger than the room you usually occupy, that the things you've been not quite looking at are still there, patient and available, waiting for conditions where you can look at them directly. The substances don't put that there. They just temporarily reduce the noise that usually prevents you from seeing it. And whether you ever encounter these substances or not, whether this entire topic is something you file under interesting but not for me, or something you're actively exploring, the thing they keep pointing at is available without them. It is available right now, in the quiet, in the dark, in the particular stillness of a late night when the usual noise has settled, and something underneath it, something that was always there, becomes briefly easier to hear. That's the thing. That's what all of this has been about. It doesn't require a ceremony or a clinical trial or a cactus. It just requires paying attention, which is, it turns out, the hardest and the simplest thing there is. So, here we are. At the end of a long, strange, surprisingly philosophical evening, you've travelled through rain-soaked Amazon ceremonies and Swiss bicycle rides and desert pilgrimages and clinical trials at Johns Hopkins and 15-minute launches into places that have no agreed-upon name. You've met the machine elves and the purge bucket and the default mode network and Maria Sabina and a Swiss chemist who just wanted to get home. You've sat at the edges of ego dissolution and mystical experience and the K-hole and the very specific kind of suffering that happens when you eat too many mushrooms and the carpet starts having opinions. And you've arrived here, on the other side of all of it, lying down, which is exactly where you should be. Here's what all of these substances, across all these traditions, across all these centuries, seem to keep saying. Not loudly, not dramatically. More like the way a very old and patient thing says something that doesn't need to be said urgently because it will still be true in the morning. They keep saying, the room is larger than the room you think you're in. The self is less fixed than it feels. The things you've been not quite looking at are still there, patient and available, and they are not as frightening as you've been treating them. And the boundary between you and everything else, that firm, convincing, constantly maintained line, is something your brain is doing, not something that is simply true. Thousands of years of human beings in deserts and rainforests and mountain villages and clinical research facilities kept returning to these plants and compounds and kept arriving at roughly the same address. That's not nothing. It's not proof of anything that can be easily measured. But it is at minimum a pattern worth noticing from the quiet of wherever you are right now. Tonight, as you settle into your bed, your ordinary, comfortable, memory foam or reasonable approximation bed, maybe take a moment, not to trip, not to dissolve anything, just to notice, without any help at all, the simple fact that you are here, breathing, aware, alive in a universe that is considerably stranger than any of us manage to remember on a regular Tuesday. The ceiling is just the ceiling, and it is also, if you let it be, kind of remarkable. Sleep well, the door is always there, and you can decide in your own time whether to open it. Good night.